Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to discuss Kubernetes architecture. So let's now we understand what is a Kubernetes architecture. Okay, to understand Kubernetes architecture, actually Kubernetes architecture work based on cluster architecture. So when important point, Kubernetes works based on cluster architecture. Cluster architecture. What is a cluster actually? Cluster means group of server. Cluster is nothing. Cluster means group of server. So group of server we can call as a cluster. Cluster means group of server. So Kubernetes architecture basically works on cluster architecture. So cluster means like group of computer. So here we are going to set up Kubernetes. So Q architecture. So Kubernetes architecture is nothing just like group of server. So let's now we understand Kubernetes architecture. So here you can check here, this architecture you can check here. In this architecture you can check here, there is two main node you are able to see. There are several server worker node and one is the master node. Okay, what is the worker node and what is the master node? Let's understand. So in Kubernetes architecture, actually basically there are two components. One is a master node and one is a worker node. Okay, what is a worker node? Worker node is nothing. Actually, any worker node may be any physical machine, any virtual machine where your container is running. It may be any machine. It may be any virtual machine. Yeah, it may be any physical machine where your Kubernetes, your container is running. So suppose I have created one Kubernetes architecture. In this Kubernetes architecture, we have two worker nodes, suppose. Two worker nodes means there are two physical machine, yeah, two virtual machine. Worker node means any virtual machine, yeah, any physical machine where your container is running. Okay, you have heard about the orchestration in Part-2. So in the orchestration, what happened? There are multiple people is there, who are singing, playing the song. In the background, they are handling multiple musicians. But here we have one person who are actually main person and who is responsible to manage all those singers which can play properly song. So it acts as a cluster architecture. In the cluster architecture, we can have multiple worker node and we have one master node. So master node is connected with all worker node and master node contain complete information about the worker node where our container is running. So master node we can call also as a control plane. So in Kubernetes architecture, there are two main parts. One is a master node and other is a worker node. So master node also known as control plane and worker node is nothing. Worker node may be any physical or virtual machine where container is running. So master node is also one machine, one server, but master node having the complete information about that cluster. In that cluster, yes, no, how many worker node, yes, no, in which worker node, how many containers running. So the entire detail, they are master node know. So in Kubernetes architecture, remember this one, Kubernetes architecture work based on cluster architecture. Cluster means group of server. In this architecture, there are two main components. One is called as a control plane. Control plane also known as master node. Master node. Second one we have worker node. Worker node. Second one we have worker node. Second one we have one worker node. Okay. Now you can check here in this architecture. Master node contains several components like API servers, scheduler, controller manager, etc. And worker node, yes, in the inside a worker node, you can check here pod. Inside a pod container, there is a Docker, kubelet, kubeproxy. There is a several component. Okay, we will understand yes all this component. Yes, no. What is this component? But first of all, understand yes, no. Kubernetes works on which principle? Kubernetes works on cluster architecture. Cluster means group of machine, a group of server. So in Kubernetes architecture, there are two main components. One is a worker node, second one is a master node. Worker node may be any physical or virtual machine. In your Kubernetes architecture, you can have n number of worker node and you have one master node. And master node contains, yes, no, these are component. API server, scheduler, controller manager, and etc. So you can check here in Kubernetes, yes, no, Kubernetes architecture, there is a control plane. Yes, no, control plane also known as master node. Control plane will contain blue component. Which component it contain? Let's understand blue components. So it contains one API server. So you need to know API server. It contains API server. Second one, it contains scheduler. And third one component it contains, you can check here, etcd. There is a etcd. You can check here etcd. And we have one more component, that is a control manager. Control manager. So these are components contained by the master node. So what is a master node, guys? Master node, actually, master nodes is a node which contain all the information about all the worker node that is a part of your cluster. Okay, so in master node you have seen, in master node, yes, no, master node contains these are part. Under master node we have these are part. One is a API server, another is a scheduler, and third one is etcd, and fourth one is a control manager. Okay, in Kubernetes worker node also you can check here. Kubernetes worker node what contains? There are several components will be held by the worker node. You can check here the diagram. You can check here this diagram in the worker node which component is available. So in Kubernetes worker node, yes, no, worker node will contain blue component. Blue components. Which components it contains? So one is a pod. Okay, pod. We will discuss what is a pod actually. Second one is a containers also. You can check here. Inside your worker node, there is a container component. And we have Docker engine also. Docker engine. And then we have one more component, that is a kubelet. You can check kubelet. And we have one more component, kubeproxy. Kubeproxy. Okay, kubeproxy. So first you need to understand, yes, no, what worker node contain component and what master node contain the component. So master node, yes, no, master node contains which component? API server, scheduler, etcd, and control manager. We will discuss in detail later on. And worker node contains these are components. In worker node, these are components are available. Pod, container, Docker engine, kubelet, and kubeproxy. Okay, so this is your Kubernetes architecture. Now, guys, if any user want to communicate, want to send a request in your Kubernetes architecture, so you can check here. So how user can communicate? Suppose if any user want to communicate with your Kubernetes cluster architecture, your Kubernetes cluster, so how they can communicate? So user can communicate either using user interface. We have one user interface. Through user interface, user can make a request, yes, no, your Kubernetes cluster, and request will be handled by the master node. Master node will analyze the request and then will redirect the request in appropriate worker node. Or otherwise, you can connect with, yes, you can communicate with your Kubernetes cluster using kubectl. So kubectl is a command line tool by which you can communicate with your control plane. Control plane means master node, because when you want to communicate with your Kubernetes cluster, so when you make a request, so request will be handled by the master node, and then master node will redirect the request to the appropriate worker node. So remember this point, how we can communicate, yes, no, how we can communicate with Kubernetes architecture, a Kubernetes cluster. So to communicate with Kubernetes control plane, guys, control plane means master node. So to communicate with Kubernetes control, Kubernetes control plane, we have two options, guys. We have two options. You can use two options. First one is the UI. This is a dashboard. This is a web dashboard. Using that dashboard, you can communicate. Our second one, you can use command line tool. So we have one command line tool, kubectl. So this is the most recommended because you can understand, various command, and using that command, you can communicate with your master node. So there are two ways, yes or no? Here to communicate with control plane, either you can communicate through UI, web dashboard, or you can communicate with kubectl. So what is a kubectl in short form? Kubectl is nothing. It is a command line tool by which we can communicate with control plane. So I hope it's clear, yes, no? What is a Kubernetes architecture? And in Kubernetes architecture, we have two main components, master node and worker node. Master node contains what component and worker node contains what component. Okay, whatever component master node contains, we will discuss in detail later on. Similar, we will discuss worker node component also in detail later on. But I hope it's clear, yes, no, what is the Kubernetes architecture and how Kubernetes works. So Kubernetes works based on which architecture? Cluster architecture. So Kubernetes basically works on cluster architecture. I hope it's clear. Thank you.